Well, speaking today as the last speaker, you have the classical problem of having facing that the dilemma that whatever you meant to say or you plan to say have been more or less dealt with by previous speakers. Although I only attended the second session, and I was pleased to listen. Sorry, the mic doesn't work.
It's only $60,000 a year to go.
Okay, right. Was it working with Yasser? Okay, so you want me to speak louder? Okay, just say it. Just say it. Right. So, I mean, whatever one has planned to say, it has been more or less dealt with by previous speakers. And I was saying, although I didn't attend the first session, because I arrived, just in time for the second one, I was pleased to listen to two good contributions by Nader and by Badur. And now I'm speaking after Yasser's own contribution, which also tackled many of the issues of that I was prepared to speak about. But let's consider that what I'm doing as a last speaker is a kind of summary of the whole event as at the end of a book. But I will also shed some maybe different light on a few issues in doing that. So the first key point that we have to keep in mind, and here I'm sticking to the title of this session, Syria in the context of Arab uprisings, is that, of course, what's happening in Syria falls completely within that context, in the sense that the Syrian uprising is absolutely no exception or different in nature than what we have seen starting from Tunisia and then Egypt and then Yemen and then Bahrain and all these countries, Libya and the rest. These are uprisings based on the same deep social economic roots, the same factors that led to this build-up of resentment against the regimes, the same blockage of economic development, and the same very skewed economic development due to the kind of social political structures that were prevailing in the region. The same, of course, direct product of all that, which is massive unemployment and especially youth unemployment. So all these factors have been present in Syria as much, if not more, than what you had in all other countries of the region, and especially those countries where you had the largest uprisings until now. So Syria fits in that context, and it may sound obvious to say it. It's not obvious, as we were saying. Many people, for instance, on the left, tried to portray the Syrian uprising as something quite different from the Egyptian or the Tunisian or whatever. And, you have the whole set of explanations generally revolving around conspiracy theory to explain that this is actually a reactionary movement and not a revolution. So that's absolutely rubbish, one should say. Second point, and I've been asked this question during a break, we have to, also to understand why the scenario, if you want, of the Syrian revolution is not the same as for countries like Egypt and Tunisia, in the sense that why didn't we see the same results of the initial uprising with the overthrow of the despot as you had in those countries? And some people, and precisely those who try to portray negatively the Syrian uprising, will explain to you that due to this conspiracy and all that, even if at the beginning there were some well-minded young people in the uprising, it very quickly was shifted into a reactionary direction by turning it military and the rest. Now, the issue that we have to understand is that this militarization of the uprising is not some kind of mistake or error or conspiracy or whatever by some people in some cases, whereas the clever Egyptians or the clever Tunisians avoided this trap. This is, again, completely, I mean, it's a kind of voluntarist view of history, as if it's just a matter of decisions, and not understanding the deep differences that they may be between the kind of political state structure that you have between different countries. And the fact that, to put it very quickly, I'll get back to these issues tomorrow, which when I'll be speaking much more generally on the Arab uprising and also the Tunisian and Egyptian cases. But basically, there is, I mean, a key difference between countries where the ruler or the ruling family, I mean, were product of the institution, but not owning the institution, the state institution. That's the case of Egypt and Tunisia. And situations like Libya or Syria, but the same applies to the Saudi kingdom, to all the monarchies, etc., where the ruling family owns the state. And in the case of Syria or the case of Libya, there has been a full reshape of the state structure, turning it into a Praetorian Guard of the regime, using very much the sectarian factor. Now, neither criticize the portrayal of the Syrian situation through purely sectarian prism. If we mean by that, and I agree with that, that this very caricatural thing that you have all the Alawites on one hand, on one side, and the Sunnis or whatever on the other side, it's obviously not the case. But it is also undeniable that the regime has used the sectarian factor as a main instrument to build an organic link between itself and the state, and that, I mean, the hardcore of the state, the real military forces, the elite forces, which are led by people belonging to the family, the tribe, the sect. And all that is very much to be seen in what is happening. And that's why it was absolutely impossible in conditions like Libya or Syria to have any downfall of the regime through popular uprising, through peaceful means, if we can say peaceful, because you had, even in Tunisia and Egypt, a lot of people killed, but nevertheless, of course, not the same numbers as you had in the situation of civil wars that developed in Libya and Syria. That's because there you have regimes which are, and the whole state apparatus were, I mean, ready to go as far as destroying their country, killing their population in order to remain in power. And faced with such regimes, of course, you can't expect mass uprising to be masochist and turn the other cheek and this kind of thing. It's impossible, because after a while, and that happened, the Syrian, if anything, the Syrian uprising was too late in reacting to the brutality of the regime, but it did its best. It did its best. It tried. For months you had this kind of attitude, and ultimately what had to happen happened. And in a sense, I mean, when I say too late, I mean by that I said it in time, in 2011, but the lack of any understanding of this on those people who I mean, proclaim themselves the leadership or the representative of the Syrian revolution, had a terrible cost. And no clarity about how to organize this armed struggle against the regime, how to denounce and to block from the start any attempts at building these ultra-jihadist, ultra-reactionary kind of forces that developed within the movement and were led to develop through various arguments, as if people were not really aware of what that would lead to. And here I want to come to the third point, which is very important. We have to understand that in the whole regional process, but here I'm focusing on Syria, in Syria in particular, but this applies to the whole region, you don't have one counter-revolution. You have several counter-revolutions. You have more than one counter-revolution. That's why I use this title more than once, for instance, about Syria, between a revolution and counter-revolutions in the plural. Well, the first, and very obviously, the first counter-revolution is the regime itself, and this brutality of the regime. But there is another counter-revolutionary force in the region. And depending on countries, you have different scenarios, because this has built up over the last decades in the region as an opposition force to the existing system or the existing regimes in the region. But these are essentially reactionary forces. And I mean here the various shades of Islamic fundamentalist forces. They do not represent at all the aspirations of the bulk of the movement that rose with this uprising and on the basis of the deep social economic roots that I mentioned, and the aspiration to democracy and freedom, but they represented agendas which were actually clashing, which were actually reactionary agendas. That is, their opposition to the existing regimes was not for progressive solutions, but actually for, as someone put it in 1848, turning back the wheel of history. And that's exactly what the kind of programs that they have. And we have seen in Syria, and that's the big complexity of the Syrian case, an amazing convergence in using this other counter-revolution by, on the one hand, the regime, and on the second hand, the strongholds of regional counter-revolution. The regime in Syria, Nader pointed to that, so I don't need to dwell on it. The regime has very, very, very obviously and consciously done its best to create a situation whereby the jihadist type of groups would become preponderant or become a major force in the Syrian uprising. Why so? Because, of course, you always have preferred enemies. And these are the preferred enemies of the regime, obviously. They are the preferred enemies of the regime. Because I mean they may prevent a sizable section of the Syrian population, including Sunnis, from adhering to the revolution, being frightened by this kind of forces. They, of course, prevent Western support to the uprising, and it's no coincidence that Gaddafi and Assad, both of them, from the very first day of the uprising in their country, said Al-Qaeda, which was a message to the West. Hey guys, we are your friends. And in the case of Gaddafi, that was absolutely true. We have been collaborating, the Syrian regime also, against Al-Qaeda, and these are Al-Qaeda, and you have to support us. That's what they meant. That's exactly what they meant. So, this has been a very, very deliberate operation on the part of the Syrian regime. But you have a convergence here with the regional stronghold of counter-revolution represented by the Gulf Cooperation Council, and especially the Saudi Kingdom, the most reactionary state not only in the region but on earth, and the Emirate of Qatar, and their competition in this regard. And how does this counter-revolution function? Well, they are busy trying to prevent the democratic and socially progressive uprising character of the uprising from prevailing. And how they do that? Various means. Either direct support to the counter-revolution, like, for instance, the Saudis today with Egypt, the former or Sisi, or through supporting, trying to co-opt the uprising through turning it from a democratic and progressive uprising, which would be a major threat to their own interest, into this jihadi, Islamic fundamentalist, whatever, Muslim Brotherhood, a kind of dominated movement, which is no threat at all to their kind of system, of structure, and ideology. And we have to be very, very clear on that. And that's what they have been doing. That's how you have had, whether states and also networks, not only states, you have also networks, reactionary religious networks from the Gulf, pouring money over the most backward, the most reactionary forces within the Syrian uprising, and leading to this result. Now, going beyond the region, or at least the Arab states, you have also a set of complex counter-revolutionary forces. I mean, the mention I mean, the fact that you have Russia and the United States here, not in the kind of situation that you could have had at the time of the Soviet Union or whatever, in some instances where it's not always the same. One of the two would support a revolution or uprising against the other. What you've got here, they are, I mean, both busy actually promoting counter-revolution in the region. And this applies also, of course, to the Iranian regime, which, when we speak of the stronghold represented, of reaction represented by the Gulf monarchies, Iran is another. Iran is also involved in a competition with these regimes, but on the social and political terrain, it is definitely not a progressive force, but a reactionary one. Now, for the United States, well, first of all, I must here bring a nuance, because Yasser, you mentioned something which, of course, is very much in the media and the press, that the United States is no longer interested in the region; it's interested in the Pacific or Asia or whatever. Well, this is not accurate. In what sense? In the sense that, of course, the United States is very much concerned by the rise of China, but the rise of China is actually an additional reason for the United States to be concerned with the Middle East and the Gulf. And that's very obviously because the dependence of China on Middle East and Gulf oil is far greater than, of course, the United States or whoever. And so it's not a matter of disinterest. It's a matter of declining influence. The United States is at its lowest point from the point of view of hegemony in the region, compared at least to the whole situation that unfolded since the peak of U.S. hegemony reached in the early 90s. The United States is now at a very low point, and that's, of course, a result of the disaster that Iraq has been for the imperial project of the United States, a huge, major disaster, probably the most important disaster, even more important, as even Kissinger, both Kissinger and Brzezinski said it before it happens, that Iraq would be a worse defeat than Vietnam, and that's indeed the case if you take what is at stake in terms of strategic interest involved. So the United States is at a weak point, and we have to understand that there is a shift of paradigm in the United States from what you had at the time of the Bush administration and what you have with the Obama administration, especially in these times of uprising. It's no longer regime change. Regime change the Iraqi way. This is no longer part of Washington's vocabulary. What is very much the motto, if you want, for Washington is orderly transition. We have to draw the lessons of Iraq. We shouldn't dismantle the state apparatuses of the region. We should keep the regimes. And indeed, as you said, Assadism without Assad. Well, we missed what we should have done in Iraq, which should have been Saddamism without Saddam. So we should not repeat this error. That's exactly the kind of perspective that is prevailing in Washington. And that's why it was quite clear. I mean, what Washington has been wanting is to, promote relatively smooth transitions, keeping the state apparatus, keeping the regime everywhere, and with the minimal price of the whoever is the president or the ruler stepping down when the situation gets to a boiling point where there's no choice but that. And about Syria, the United States has been very clear from the beginning. I mean, even if you look the time it took Washington even to say that Assad should go, which was quite remarkable. And then this whole idea that what should happen is Assad stepping down, handing power to someone of his entourage or whatever, and then we get a deal. And that's what Obama himself very clearly called it, the Yemen solution. That's exactly what happened in Yemen, which is a caricature of and a real, killing in the bud of the Yemeni revolution, and that's what they contemplate for Syria, and that's the meaning of relying on the likes of Lakhdar Brahimi and the rest. Washington trying to push on that and betting or trying to convince the Russians to cooperate with them. Washington's main strategy, and that's how you understand this causing up of Kerry with Lavrov and all that. Despite everything, they keep causing up because they want the Russians to exert pressure on the Syrian regime in order to get this kind of change. So that's what you have. And finally, that means what? That means that the Syrian revolution, that is, the Syrian uprising, the real values and aspirations that were prevailing in the whole first period of the Syrian uprising, this Syrian revolution is tragically alone, absolutely tragically alone. It is facing many counter-revolutions. It has very few friends, even on the left. We were saying it's really tragic, and it is getting strangulated and more falling between the hammer of the regime and the anvil of the jihadists and other reactionary forces. And it is really a tragic situation. We shouldn't fool ourselves. Of course, we should say and explain that the situation in Syria is not the regime and the jihadists, period. Of course, this whole potential of the revolution is still there, whether, in this mass movement, but a lot of this potential now is kept silent, it feels really squeezed between these reactionary forces. And this is even, we can speak of it in human terms, that the number of people who, feel completely lost in this situation, and many of them are leaving. Many of them are leaving the country, going abroad and saying, we can't stand it. We can't make a choice between these two reactionary forces. So we have to understand that the situation is very tragic, and definitely, I would agree definitely with Nader what he said on the ceasefire or whatever, because as long as the dynamics of the armed confrontation is one which is promoting this polarization between two counter-revolutionary poles, of course, we can't, and anyone on the left or whatever wanting to fight from abroad until the last Syrian is indecent. A term I've been using for a previous situation. I would use it for Syria also. It is indecent to try to outbid from outside like that. So it's up to the Syrian forces, to the Syrian opposition or whatever, to decide what they want. But it's obvious that the Syrian population is exhausted. The Syrian people are exhausted, and they need to breathe. They need to breathe. And from the human perspective, of course, one cannot be against ceasefires or whatever. But of course, this with the very clear conscience that as long as this regime is there, it can't stop. It can't end. Now, I want to end by pointing to the fact that there have been people very much busy writing obituaries of the Arab uprisings, month after month, year after year, because we are now in the third year. You have people writing, definitely, enthused about writing obituaries and drawing, of course, some political consequences, or using these obituaries to justify their kind of political positions. Now, when Morsi was elected, you had a whole lot of comments on the Islamic winter, yeah, and the same spirit of writing obituaries prevail on those who comment on the Syrian situation. Now, again, it is tragic. I emphasize this enough, and so I don't need to repeat it. But the potential, there is definitely a very important potential, and it is definitely clear in my mind that the big majority, the vast majority of the Syrian population doesn't want at all, neither the regime nor the jihadist Sharia type of reactionary forces. And as we have seen in Egypt with the very quick shift in the situation, as we see everywhere where the turmoil is going on, what started regionally in 2011 is a revolutionary process which will go on for years to come, for years and decades to come, and there will be plenty of space in the future for Syrian progressive forces to take the lead again in their own country. But in the meantime, I think really we should relate to the Syrian revolution in terms of solidarity and not exploitation for whatever sectarian reasons we may have. Thank you very much.